This incident took place in Siberia in 1976, during the later years of the Soviet Union. At that time, large parts of Siberia were still barely explored, even by the government itself. Maps showed vast green and white spaces with very few markings. Roads appeared and disappeared depending on the season. Entire transport routes existed for only a few years before being abandoned. The Soviet military relied heavily on these temporary routes. They were used to supply remote radar installations, storage depots, communication relay points, and other facilities that were never meant to be permanent. Building proper roads in those areas was expensive and unnecessary, so instead, rough forest roads were cut through the taiga and used only when needed. One of these routes ran through a remote stretch of taiga in central Siberia. Officially, there was nothing significant in that area. No towns, no villages, no major military bases. Just forest, rivers, and frozen ground for most of the year. Unofficially, the area had a reputation. Local hunters, mainly Evenki and other indigenous people, rarely traveled through certain parts of that forest. When asked why, they never gave dramatic answers. They didn't talk about monsters or spirits in detail. They simply said that some areas were wrong and better left alone. The military dismissed this. They always did. Superstition had no place in official planning. In late 1976, a small convoy was assigned to move supplies along that route. The operation itself was routine. It involved transporting equipment from one isolated facility to another before winter fully set in and made travel impossible. The convoy consisted of 2 Ural 375D military trucks and 1 escort vehicle. There were 7 soldiers in total. These were not inexperienced men. Most of them had spent years driving and operating vehicles in Siberian conditions. They were familiar with extreme cold, isolation, wildlife, and the general dangers of the taiga. The planned journey was supposed to take 3 days. The first day passed without incident. The road was rough but manageable. The weather held steady. The convoy stopped at designated rest points, checked vehicles, and continued. The second day was much the same. Long hours of driving through forest that never seemed to change. Tall trees, narrow roads, frozen ground. Nothing unusual. It was on the third day, late in the evening, that things began to feel different. As the convoy moved deeper into the forest, the road became narrower. The trees grew closer together, and the forest felt denser. Snow had started to fall lightly, and the temperature dropped as daylight faded. One of the drivers later said that before they saw anything, he noticed the silence. Not the normal quiet of a forest, but something heavier. The engine noise didn't seem to travel far. There was no wind moving through the trees, no distant animal sounds. The convoy slowed naturally as visibility decreased. Driving at night in the taiga was always risky. Wildlife could appear suddenly, and a collision with a large animal like an elk could destroy a vehicle and leave the crew stranded. As the lead truck rounded a gentle bend in the road, the headlights caught movement ahead. The driver immediately assumed it was an elk. That assumption made sense. Elk were common in the region, especially near forest roads. They were large, unpredictable, and known to freeze in place when caught in headlights. The driver slowed the truck, signaling the rest of the convoy to reduce speed. The headlights fully illuminated the figure standing in the road. It didn't move. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Elk usually reacted quickly, either crossing the road or retreating into the trees. This one stayed exactly where it was, facing the convoy. As the vehicles slowed further, the soldiers began to notice details that didn't fit. The animal was tall, but its body looked unusually narrow. The proportions didn't match what they were used to seeing. The torso seemed thinner than an elk's, and the neck was too straight, almost rigid. The head looked deer-like, but even that wasn't entirely convincing. Something about the way it held its head felt unnatural. Then it shifted its weight. The front legs bent, not backward, like the legs of a deer or elk, forward. at the joint the way a human arm bends at the elbow. This wasn't a sudden movement. It was slow and controlled. One of the soldiers later said that moment stayed with him more than anything else. He said it wasn't fear at first. It was confusion so strong that his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The convoy came to a complete stop. The creature remained in place. It didn't seem injured. It didn't stumble or struggle to hold its posture. The movement looked intentional, as if it was adjusting itself rather than reacting. The headlights stayed fixed on it. The engines idled. The soldiers noticed another detail that made the situation worse. The eyes didn't reflect light. Most animals have eyes that shine brightly when caught in headlights at night. This creature's eyes didn't. They appeared dark, flat, and lifeless, like glass or polished stone. No one in the convoy spoke at first. No one raised a weapon. Later, when asked why, several of the men gave similar answers. They didn't feel threatened in the way soldiers usually do. It didn't feel like an ambush or an attack. It felt like something else entirely. They felt observed. As the vehicles sat there, the forest went completely silent. It wasn't gradual. There was no fading of sound. It was sudden, like a switch being turned off. No wind, no distant noises, nothing. Then they heard it. A sound coming from the creature. It wasn't a call, a growl, or a cry. It sounded like breathing. Slow, controlled, almost measured. One of the men later said the breathing didn't sound strained or animalistic. It sounded deliberate, as if the creature was aware of its own presence and the attention it was receiving. After several seconds, the creature adjusted its posture again. It lifted its front half slightly higher, bending the forelegs further. The joints rotated in a way that no deer's legs should be able to without breaking. At that moment, one of the drivers quietly said over the radio that it wasn't an animal. No one disagreed. The creature didn't move toward the convoy. It didn't show aggression. It simply stood there, facing the vehicles, its head slightly tilted. One soldier later said that when he looked into its eyes, he felt something he struggled to describe. Not fear exactly, and not curiosity. Felt like recognition, as if the creature understood what they were and why they were there. Time became difficult to judge. After the incident, the men couldn't agree on how long the encounter lasted. Some believed it was only a few minutes. Others thought it went on much longer. When they checked the clocks in their vehicles afterward, the times didn't line up properly. Eventually, without any obvious signal, the creature stepped off the road. It didn't run. It didn't rush. It moved slowly, one step at a time, disappearing between the trees. The forest didn't immediately return to normal. The silence lingered for several seconds before the wind and distant sounds gradually returned. The convoy did not continue forward. After a brief discussion, the convoy leader ordered the vehicles to reverse. Carefully, slowly, they backed away along the narrow road. No one spoke until they were far enough that the headlights no longer illuminated the bend where the creature had been standing. When they finally stopped, one soldier became physically sick. Another refused to stay alone in his vehicle. None of them slept that night. The next morning, they returned to their departure point instead of completing the route. A report was filed. It was rewritten, then shortened, then classified. Within months, that transport route was officially removed from use. No explanation was given. The road was left to be reclaimed by the forest. The men involved rarely spoke about what they saw again. After the convoy returned to their starting point, the incident was reported through proper military channels. At first, it was treated like any other unusual encounter involving wildlife. Siberia had always been unpredictable, and strange animal behavior wasn't unheard of. But this report was different. The soldiers didn't describe the creature as an injured elk or a deformed animal. They avoided assigning it a clear category. Instead, they focused on specific observations: posture, movement, joint structure, lack of eye reflection, and behavior that suggested awareness rather than instinct. The first version of the report was considered too detailed. It was sent back. The second version removed emotional language and simplified the description. Even then, it raised concerns. The anatomical details didn't match any known animal in the region. A third version was created. This one was brief, technical, and vague. It mentioned an unidentified large animal obstructing the route and abnormal behavior. No mention of joint movement. No mention of eye reflection. No mention of prolonged observation. That version was archived. What didn't disappear, however, was the concern. Within weeks, a small reconnaissance team was assigned to evaluate the route. Their task was simple: assess whether the road could still be used safely before winter made access impossible. They didn't encounter the creature again, but they noticed other things. The stretch of road where the incident occurred showed signs of long-term avoidance by wildlife. There were no tracks crossing it, not just recent tracks but older ones either. In a forest that should have been full of signs of movement, this absence stood out. The surrounding trees were intact. No broken branches. No signs of a large animal crashing through undergrowth. Whatever had stepped off the road had done so carefully. The reconnaissance team also reported that the area felt unusually quiet, even during daylight hours. Again, nothing that could be written as evidence, just an observation repeated by multiple people independently. After that evaluation, higher command made a decision. The route was no longer necessary. Officially, it was due to logistical redundancy. Unofficially, no one pushed to reopen it. Maps were updated. The route was marked inactive. No replacement road was built. The forest was left to reclaim it. Years later, some of the men involved spoke privately about the incident after leaving military service. They didn't embellish the story. In fact, most of them avoided discussing it unless asked directly. One thing they all agreed on was the name. They never called it a monster. They never called it a spirit. They called it not a deer. That phrasing matters. They weren't saying it looked like a deer and wasn't one. They were saying that whatever it was, calling it an animal felt wrong. Local hunters, when later asked about strange encounters in that region, gave responses that were unsettling in their simplicity. They acknowledged that animals sometimes stood on two legs briefly. Bears did that. Injured animals behaved strangely. That wasn't the issue. The issue, according to them, was movement that showed understanding. One hunter reportedly said that animals don't adjust themselves in front of humans. They react. They flee. They attack. Or they freeze. They don't observe. The older hunters also mentioned that certain forest areas were avoided not because of danger, but because of presence. They described it as places where something stays. Not hunts. Not travels. Stays. From a scientific perspective, several explanations have been suggested over the years by researchers and enthusiasts who became aware of the case through leaked accounts. Some suggested a severely deformed elk. Others proposed a bear with mange or joint abnormalities. A few speculated about unknown subspecies or extreme injury. But none of these explanations fully addressed the reported joint movement, posture control, lack of eye reflection, and calm behavior under direct observation. Most importantly, none explained why experienced Siberian soldiers, men familiar with wildlife, refused to classify it as an animal even decades later. There was no follow-up investigation made public. No biological samples. No photographs. No official denial either. That silence is typical of the Soviet system, especially regarding incidents that didn't fit existing categories and didn't pose an immediate strategic threat. The route remained abandoned. Over time, trees fell across it. Snow buried it. New growth erased the tracks. Eventually, even satellite images struggled to identify where the road had been. The incident faded into obscurity. But among a small group of former transport personnel and hunters, the story persisted, not as a warning but as a reminder, that even in places humans believe they've mapped and controlled, There are still things they don't fully understand. And sometimes the most unsettling encounters aren't violent. They're quiet. They stand in the road, look back at you, and let you leave.